name's Gomer. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing as a part of the Meaningful Consent and Digital Economy project, which I work on with my supervisor, MC Schregel, and Chris Cooper, who works at a company called No Now Information, who we've been working on trying to prototype some of the ideas in this presentation. So I'm going to talk about token-based consent management and the way that this can support data subjects' rights, particularly around consent, obviously, broadly as one approach to consent management. So I'll introduce both. I always like to start with this because it frames how we think of consent on the Meaningful Consent project. We see consent in quite a broad way. We see it as giving people a genuine choice in the context of them actually understanding the implications of what happens when they make those choices. We specifically talk about meaningful consent instead of informed consent because it doesn't come with all the legal baggage. And we sometimes like to turn this around and say that actually consent is not just the end goal, right? Consent is the natural result of giving people a genuine choice and having them understand what they're making a choice about. And these are both properties that we would like to foster in a sort of liberal democracy, even without this explicit requirement around consent. What I will often argue is that consent is a byproduct. It's inevitable if we get these first two things right. Of course, where we're at today are these pretty annoying messages on websites and something about cookies. These are a narrow kind of interaction, they're notice and consent, but they seem to be where everyone is stuck. Again, we take a really broad view of consent and say this is one class of thing that we've tried that isn't working great at the moment, but can we do better? This isn't, though, the topic of really what I want to talk about today. Interaction is important. We'll talk in a sec about how consent is an interaction problem, but how we do this interaction is almost orthogonal to the actual process of consent management. So, consent is an interaction problem. Because consent is transactional, it necessarily involves two parties coming to an agreement, hopefully with both of them understanding what they've agreed to. Which means that, at least to me, because I'm an interaction designer, consent is an interaction problem. And so we need that input from design. Of course, consent, because it's embedded in the regulations, is also a compliance problem. Controllers need to be able to demonstrate that they've been seeking consent in a way that is compliant with what the law says, so that they can demonstrate that people they've been asking for consent have some understanding of what they've been asked, that they've genuinely made that choice, and that they can go back and audit that when they're asked to do so, either by the individuals themselves or by a regulator. And for them to show that the mechanism they used was appropriate. We've got all sorts of guidelines about whether the checkbox should be ticked or unticked, whether your wording should be positive or negative, whether you're answering in the affirmative or not. And it may be that some of these things actually don't foster support. And of course the GDPR says the controller should be able to demonstrate that the subject has given consent to the processing operation. We now have this explicit requirement to be able to go back and show that you've done this. So that raises some challenges. There are a few key challenges in this space that we call consent management, which is broadly doing the management of your consent, providing that audit trail in parallel to your existing data processing operations, and about coupling those two things together. So that when you're processing data, that's really tightly coupled to getting to the consent to do that, if consent is the basis you're relying on in law to do that, or if consent is something you think is important in developing the sort of trust that you want to foster with your customers. The first of those challenges that I mentioned is audit. How do we get that trail from that button press, that key press, that thing you said on the telephone, because consent doesn't only happen on the screen. How do we trace that all the way through to where you actually process the data and that has some outcome for a data subject, or even further to the point that they complain to a regulator that you've done something wrong. The second challenge is a regulatory change. So we can put a consent management system in place, we can collect consent, and then a regulation changes. And this needn't even be the massive pieces of legislation like the General Data Protection Regulation. This could be as a result of an opinion from Article 29 Working Party. This could be the opinion of the regulator in one country changes. It could be a particular piece of case law that just shifts how we're thinking about consent. It could be that one interaction we've been relying on a particular piece of wording is no longer good enough, and the consent you've collected based on that now needs to be revisited. Being able to do that so that when these words on the beach are washed away is an important aspect that a good consent management system should be able to address. And of course, subject control. The whole point of having this idea of consent is that the data subject has some more control, at least feels like they have some more control over what's happening with their data. Ideally, we'd be able to build some kind of dashboard so that they can interrogate this consent they're given on their own terms. But it's not just service providers who know who's consented to what, but so that we as digital citizens know what we've consented to and when, and we can revisit that. Because of course the new regulation also says you have to be able to take the consent away, and that has to be about as easy as it was to give it in the first place. Which, in the current environment, where it's very easy to give consent, means it has to be pretty easy to take it back, or at least to change it. And so I'm going to talk about one approach which we've been thinking about, which is token-based consent management. So this is, I guess, one class of consent management. To me, it's by far the most obvious, but I don't want to claim it's the only way you could manage consent. And broadly, this means bringing together the data subject or the user with a data processor through some kind of consent interaction. And like I say, we're interaction agnostic. How this interaction is done is almost an implementation detail. And you can imagine one service provider using many kinds of interaction. And as a result of these interactions, generating what you might consider some kind of artifact. So it's a consent artifact, a consent token. People like the consent working group at Kantara would call this a consent receipt. It's just something that represents the key factors of the interaction that just took place. So that you can say, this piece of data represents the consent that was given by a user. It represents how they gave it, who they gave it to, how long it lasts, things like that. And then this supports, A, coupling the data processing that's taking place to that token, so you can constantly query it to say, can I do this process? Has that consent been withdrawn? Was it given in the first place? And it supports this idea of showing the user what they've consented to. In the abstract, this consent artifact is just sort of in the ether. In practice, you'd embody that either within some kind of API, some kind of provider that holds the tokens, or through some kind of synchronized database record. That's sort of what it matters. And this supports these different kinds of interaction. This can support the standard tick box. You know, you could retrofit this behind those mailing list opt-ins that we see today. You can use it with more advanced, say, slider interfaces. You can use it when someone says, yeah, it's okay to send me your newsletter over the telephone. If you wanted to, you just say this is a telephone consent. And it supports what we might consider more novel forms of consent interaction. So one of the other work streams we have at Southampton is looking at how we build semi-autonomous agents to help us manage consent in the moment, so that you're no longer consenting in real time, but you set some preferences and you go and review things. But over time, the minute-to-minute interactions are managed on your behalf by somebody in your phone. I appreciate all of these can be supported if you're interaction agnostic. So the token itself, represented by the pink tick in the middle, needs to have a few key features sort of at a minimum. We need to know the identities of the two parties in some sense. That needn't be a canonical identity, but you need to know it at least in the sense that you can link it to a particular record in the database that you're going to process. And of course, data subjects will want to know who they gave this consent to, so in some way you have to identify the service provider. Some metadata, like when this happened, potentially other temporal data, like when this consent expires. It may come with a time limit. It may introduce revisited, or it may just be completely wiped off a certain amount of time. We want to know the type of interaction that was used and anything important about that. So maybe we're relying on a checkbox, but was that checkbox ticked already? How big was it? What colour was it? Where was it on the screen? These are all things from an interaction design point of view that can really deeply influence whether or not someone would have ticked it, and just like you probably want to store for auditing later on. And of course we want to know something about the language that was used. And this is important in two senses. First of all, it's important semantically. We want to know what concepts were invoked, what purposes were stated at the point this consent was given, as well as how we actually collected the signal. And from a lexical point of view, we want to know what exact words were on the screen at the point that this person ticked the box. Because of course it's those words that form that legal basis underpinning the consent that was given. And so knowing all of these things and wrapping these up as a consent token gives you this really rich queryable record that you can reason over far better than the approach today, which is typically a 1 in the database column saying, yes, we have marketing consent. This tells you not only that you have marketing consent, but when you got it, how you got it, what language you used, and who you got it from. And so that supports this tight coupling between data processing activities and consent management itself. So I tried to do that in this diagram here to give you some idea of, say, the life cycle of a given consent token. So time is along the bottom, so we're starting over on the left. And so this first interaction is the initial consent interaction. This is where we get a consent token from someone. So this could be signing up to some online service, and you're saying, okay, you can have this data about me, that's fine, we can rely on consent to process that. Which allows this data processor to use some set of purposes, purpose set A. They can process it for those purposes for as long as they like. At some point, that consent might be mutated or changed. That could be as a result of the user logging into a dashboard and saying, actually, I kind of regret sharing my health data with you. It could be at the request of a service provider saying, actually, we've identified this new purpose. Can we just ping everyone we have a token from and ask them for consent to do this? At that point, a new set of purposes is possible. And this could be a subset, it could be a superset of the original purposes, it could be completely disjoint. So for a while, that's processing purpose set B. And then some opinion comes out that says, actually, that consent we got for some reason is now invalid. This interaction mechanism we're relying on doesn't work. The wording we thought was good enough actually isn't. And it turns out that actually, maybe empirically, people who we thought had consented, it turns out didn't understand. But we can identify all of the tokens with this particular property, so the ones that involve this particular piece of wording. And we can go back to them and say, actually, they're no good, but can we re-establish that by pinging these people again and say, actually, that wasn't good enough, could you just, check it again? Then allow that processing to continue, and then finally to revoke that consent for some reason. Maybe it just expires, that relationship is ended. This also unlocks this idea of a dashboard, to be able to aggregate these consent tokens up to people so that they can say, okay, who has consent for my health data? Or to take a purpose-based approach, who has my consent to contact me by email, to deliver targeted advertising, and to aggregate these decisions up and allow them to be queried. So I might say, okay, I want to know who has access to my browsing history. In practice, this would involve everyone who can give consent to sort of behavioural profiling via advertising, and say, okay, I told the Guardian that was okay, plus all these mobile apps, but I don't want to go back and revoke that. And it means you can show them the history. If consent tokens are changing over time, you might want to go back and say, well, they used to have these permissions, and then look, I took away my contact details and says, actually, don't contact me by email, I don't want that anymore. But to have that audit trail, either for you as an individual, to give an aggregated view to service providers so they can see actually what are the trends in what people are giving or not giving us consent for, or to a regulator to say, this person's complained, can we see where it went wrong, what the user had given consent to at different points. So in summary, the idea of consent management, token-based consent management in particular, is to couple data processing to a sort of tangible record of consent, these tangible digital things. And crucially, to make consent decisions mutable or changeable, because by constantly querying this token, by changing the token, you change the processing that takes place. These tokens provide a record of language, interaction, and parties who are involved, which gives you quite a strong audit track. It also means you can come back and reason over those artifacts to be flexible and responsive to change in what's best practice and what's legally allowed. There's more information about meaningful consent in addition to the project on meaningfulconsent.org. Like I say, we're working with a company called Know Now Information and whoever website's there to actually prototype this. So I guess we can do it. Questions? Yeah. Thank you.